my conversation with Sergeant Crawley, there was discussion about he and I and Professor Gates having a beer here in the White House.
Cop, professor, and president unlikely get together in the White House. At stake, race relations and equality in America. Should President Obama have ventured into the issue everyone's arguing about in the United States? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the program. I'm Nick Clark. Today's issue, racism, precarious territory, always likely to trigger strong emotions. And now the US president is in the thick of the debate. A racial spat in Massachusetts 2 weeks ago has spiraled into controversy after Barack Obama said his piece about the affair. And now the scholar and the policeman involved in the row have been invited to the White House to discuss the whole business. Rosalind Jordan from Washington, D.C. has this report on the incident.
Racial profiling in the United States. Everyone is talking about it again because of a recent phone call to the police in Cambridge, Massachusetts.
Two gentlemen trying to get in a house at that number, 17 Ware Street.
The officer who responded to the scene is white. The man he arrested for disorderly conduct is black, but he's also an author, Harvard University professor, and one of the most reputed scholars in the history of race relations in America. Henry Louis Gates was returning from a trip abroad when he had difficulty opening the front door to his home. With his driver, also a black man, Gates forced his way in. Once alone in the house, the police came, and although he showed identification showing he lived at the address, Gates was handcuffed and arrested. The police officer said Gates was uncooperative and shouted at him, accusing him of racism. He was charged with disorderly conduct. The charge was later dropped. Now, it could have been just a local news story, but it made international headlines after President Barack Obama made this comment during a recent press conference.
I think it's fair to say, number one, any of us would be pretty angry. Number two, that the Cambridge police acted stupidly in arresting somebody when there was already proof that they were in their own home.
The question now, will the incident between the elite Harvard professor and Sergeant James Crowley lead to a truly teachable moment for Americans? President Obama later said he regretted using the word stupidly. Since the days of slavery, Africans and their descendants were portrayed as savages. Legal discrimination after the U.S. Civil War deepened stereotypes of blacks' propensity to break laws. Even after voting for an African-American president, racial stereotypes and racial profiling among Americans persist.
The fact that blacks and Hispanics are picked up more frequently, and oftentimes for no cause, casts suspicion even when there is good cause.
Federal law enforcement statistics back the president up. Blacks make up 12% of the total U.S. population, but they are 40% of the prison and jail population. Earlier this year, Obama's own attorney general angered some when he said Americans simply couldn't talk about race.
Though this nation has proudly thought of itself as an ethnic melting pot, in things racial, we have always been, and we, I believe, continue to be, in too many ways, essentially a nation of cowards.
The first African-American president says he has every right to comment on social issues and is hoping Thursday's meeting with Gates and Crowley leads to changes for the better between the U.S.'s ethnic and racial groups. Still, it will probably take more than just a breaking of bread and a photo op to heal racial divisions that go back hundreds of years. Rosalind Jordan for Inside Story.
Well, it's a big pertinent debate in the U.S. right now, and joining us to discuss it today in Washington, D.C., Paul Butler, a former federal prosecutor and an associate dean and professor of law at George Washington University. In Florida, Laurie Friedel, an associate professor of criminology at the University of South Florida. She consults with police departments and provides command-level training on racial profiling. And finally, in New York, we have Glenn Ford, who is the executive director of the Black Agenda report. Mr. Butler, could I start with you first of all? It's a curious business, this, isn't it? You know, white cop, black Harvard scholar, biracial president, all some would argue at fault in one way or another over this issue. Having this rather meaningful drink together in the White House, you've got to think it's a good thing that this has happened.
Well, a beer fest probably isn't the best way to resolve this age-old problem. You know, the president isn't some mediator between a cop and a citizen, so the teachable moment has got to be about why 1 in 3 young black men has a criminal case and the relationship to that of racial profiling. So the problem is much larger than something that can be resolved over a Budweiser.
All right, well, Glenn Ford, would you say that Mr. Gates was arrested simply because he was black?
Well, we know that Professor Gates was treated differently because he was black. But we must point out that this is a very unrepresentative black man. And in fact, we're talking about 2 quite unrepresentative black men, that is Barack Obama and Professor Gates. In New York City, where I'm speaking from, by the end of this year, the police will have stopped 628,000 persons on the street. 90% of those persons will be black and Latino. Only 10% will be white, even though the city is almost half white. And the most telling statistic is that of the white people, that small, slim slither of folks that they do stop, these white people are much more likely to be arrested than the huge numbers of blacks and Latinos. So we see that only the most suspicious looking white people are routinely stopped, but apparently young black men and young Hispanic men are not just stopped for no good reason, but repeatedly. You can't get numbers like that without repeated stops of the same people for no reason and with no charges.
So this is a direct result of so-called racial profiling.
Oh yes, and in fact, all of the indices of racial imbalance, of disproportionate outcomes for people's lives in the United States because of their race. All of these indices are going up or down, if you like. That is, things are getting worse statistically for black folks on almost every measurable level. Black male income has been declining for 30 years. Median black family income has declined since 1974. In 74, it was 63% of white income. Now it's 58%. So objectively speaking, things are getting worse by measurable data.
Okay, let's bring in Laurie Friedel. The arrest of Professor Gates, an example of racial profiling that's endemic in the US.
Well, I don't like to comment on particular incidents because it requires me to get inside of people's heads, and I'm not qualified to do that. But this incident does have indices of high-risk situations in the United States. First of all, in a medium to high-income residential neighborhood, the lamentable fact is that it's going to be predominantly white residents, and in the United States there are associations, conscious and unconscious, between people of color and crime, so it's highly likely that a person in that neighborhood would call the police on 2 black men that are on the porch where they might not have called if it were 2 white women or even 2 white men. So this absolutely reflects some of the high-risk indicators that produce racial bias, not only on the part of callers, but then on the part of the police.
And what do you think that says about modern-day America?
It says about modern-day America that we're still dealing with this issue. Now, I would certainly argue that we've come a long way. I respect the statistics that were just cited, but not only is American society better than it was 30, 40 years ago in terms of race relations generally, but I would argue that the police are a lot better than they were 30, 40 years ago. We still have a long way to go, but I think we have a policing profession now that can engage in change efforts if we can get moving in that direction, and I think we need to change the nature of the debate to produce change.
So in that sense, do you mean that this particular example and other cases like it, we're not talking about overt racism as such, but more a kind of almost a subconscious bias?
Well, both exist. So we have racists in policing as we do in all professions. But I think what does get ignored is the fact that in our society, the social psychologists have shown through voluminous research that many of us in America have unconscious biases, particularly those that link people of color to crime. So I can imagine an officer that swears up and down that race did not impact on his or her decisions, and I would argue maybe it did, but below conscious level. Has to be an important part of our discussion. Not only does it provide direction for our intervention efforts, but it also can reduce the destructiveness of the debate. If we recognize that even the best police officers might practice racially biased policing, and even the best agencies, because they hire human beings, have to be proactive in promoting fair and impartial policing.
All right, well, Paul Butler, it's interesting, isn't it? What do you say to those people who say that some are just too quick to cry racism in incidents like this?
Well, Nick, actually, I don't think racism is the most helpful way to think about the problem. You know, I'm a former prosecutor. I've locked up a bunch of people of all different races, including some black people who deserve to be in prison. At the same time, I've been profiled, and guess what? I've been profiled as much by black cops as I have by white cops. And so the issue is more complicated in 2009 when we have an African-American president, you know, and the real issue is effective law enforcement, because that's what people from every community want. And when the police were harassing Skip Gates, he's a 58-year-old man, a slight man with a cane, they weren't catching the real bad guys. And that's ultimately the problem with this biased criminal justice system. It just doesn't help the police enforce the law in the smartest way.
But of course, some people would say that it was Professor Gates's behavior when he was arrested that was at stake and not the color of his skin.
Well, you know what, Nick? It's not against the law in the United States to talk back to the police. And the truth is, anybody who gets confronted in their own home by the police and made to show ID is going to get upset, as President Obama acknowledged. So President Henry Gates didn't break the law. And the reality is that cops in any big city in the United States, they hear much worse things shouted at their squad car every day. If you're a good cop, you ignore it. What you're focused on is, again, people who break the law, not people with a bad attitude.
So, Glenn Ford, what do you make of the fact that the president stepped into all this? Isn't it right to say that he did so because this is, as some people have said, a bourgeois buddy of his, and maybe this isn't in itself about race, and something you alluded to a little bit earlier, I think, it's more about class?
Well, I think that's kind of obvious, and let's talk about some other racial incidents that certainly deserve the president's attention, if this incident deserved that kind of attention. When Sean Bell in New York City was killed in a barrage of 50 bullets, then candidate Obama said that, this is a nation of laws and we should just accept the verdict. He had a very terse reaction to that, much more terse and less caring, in fact, than his opponent in the primaries, Hillary Clinton, who offered condolences to Sean Bell's family, etc. Earlier this year, again, this time in Oakland, California, Oscar Grant was shot in the back while handcuffed and face down in front of many onlookers, and it was videotaped. President Obama had nothing to say about that. He's chosen to speak to the race issue when a person that is much more of his class is insulted by being treated in this way.
Okay,
so
Mr. Ford, I'm just going to jump in there.
I'm
just going to jump in there because you've got two very good examples there, and I just want to bring in Laurie Friedel. I apologise for moving it on, but we don't have that much time. Laurie, it's true to say that President Obama doesn't tend to intervene when thousands of blacks are arrested for no reason, but he has in this case.
And I think Mr. Ford's comments, they're well taken. I will say this, I am pleased that this is back on our radar screen, even if this isn't the event that maybe should have produced our attention. This was an issue that was front and center. It came back to the fore in the late 1990s, but then it dissipated after the events of 9/11. So it is very important that this get back on our radar screen, that this be an issue with which we are dealing and having this discussion. So I am at least pleased about that.
Okay, well, let's just remind ourselves of President Obama's election, and it was seen as a huge step forward in the fight for equality. But of course, some African Americans claim that his victory could undermine the civil rights movement. After the Civil War in the 19th century, the US Congress outlawed slavery and granted citizenship to African Americans. But of course, blacks were prevented from voting and suffered racial segregation in the use of government facilities and public services. In 1955, the famous Rosa Parks refused to give up her bus seat to a white passenger, and her arrest led to the rise of the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, well, that was followed by sweeping civil rights legislation. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act banned the voter test, which disenfranchised most black people. All right, well, that was then. That's 40-odd years ago. So what about now? What does this particular incident say about how far or otherwise America has come in those 4 decades? Paul Butler, Laurie Friedel earlier was saying that we've come quite a long way in the last 3 or 4 decades. What do you think?
Well, you know, we've made significant progress. The fact that we have an African-American president, his wife is the descendant of slaves, and now he's the leader of the United States. That's great news. My own life story has been about the success of the civil rights movement. I got into Yale, into Harvard Law School because of civil rights success. So the problem is that at the same time, a lot of people have achieved, there's still a lot of people who are shut out. So now there are more people, more black people locked up than at any other point in our history. So, you know, while some progress has been made, we still have a long way to go.
Glenn Ford, interesting that the clip that we ran earlier of the US Attorney General Eric Holder saying, "I believe we continue to be, in matters of race, a nation of cowards." Interesting that he said that. What do you make of those comments?
Oh, I applaud the Attorney General's comments. I was pleasantly surprised to hear them. In terms of how far we have come, it is incontrovertible that the United States of America, a nation born in slavery and genocide, now having a chief executive who is black, certainly is a sign of great change. However, when President Obama makes statements such as he made in Selma, Alabama on the campaign trail, that black folks have come 90% of the way, I think that is a harmful statement because it tends to tell the larger public that the problem is almost solved. And in fact, the problem is not almost solved. And the metrics say that we have not come 90% of the way, that in many, according to many measurements, we are falling further behind. And so the presidential bully pulpit is not just a place to show one's color, it's to call attention to the real ills of the country and a deteriorating racial situation in some respects is part of a fact of American life that the president should address.
Of course, the fact is in the run-up to the election, the future president didn't really touch on race as such, did he, to any great extent? But now he's kind of stumbled into the role many say he was destined to play in many ways. Laurie Friedel, what do you make of that?
Well, my expertise is in racial profiling and not in the politics or Obama's role. I mean, my focus is on what police departments can and should be doing to promote fair and impartial policing. And going back to what Professor Butler said, the term racism has very strong connotations in America. It denotes evilness. And when I hear that racially biased policing is caused solely by widespread racism in policing, I think that is an erroneous and narrow conceptualization that not only leads us down the wrong path for intervention, but also increases the defensiveness and sets up barriers for change.
So what do you think we have here? Is it too simplistic to say it is an opportunity for true racial reconciliation, Mr. Butler?
Yeah, that's way too simple because, you know, we have these moments all the time with the O.J. Simpson case, with Rodney King, a black man who was beaten by police and it was shown on TV. We always think, well, this is an opportunity for change, and yet things in the criminal justice system just get worse. And so, you know, there's some optimism about today, but the politics of criminal justice are just so dysfunctional. Politicians think that they can get votes by promising to lock more people up, which usually translates to locking more African Americans up. And even in this moment, President Obama does seem to have fallen prey to those politics. You know, he kind of backtracked his critique of the police. And so I'm not real optimistic about this teachable moment, Nick.
Glenn Ford, are you optimistic about the teachable moment? Is your glass half full or half empty?
Well, people think that they're learning lessons. I don't know if people are learning the right lessons. Look, the statistic of about 1 million blacks in jail begins with a public policy that super surveils black communities. That's what stop and frisk is all about. That multiplies the chances of being in a confrontation with police, especially if you are young and black and male. So if we are not talking about the structures of law enforcement in this country, rather than can two guys have a beer and settle their differences over an incident, then we're not really, we haven't learned much from that moment.
So talking of learning much from the moment, Laurie Friedel, what do you think the police will get out of all this when they look back at this moment in years to come? Will it be a kind of watershed, do you think?
I think it can be. And again, I think we need to change the nature of the debate so that the police are willing to come forward and recognize that this is an issue that even the best police departments can have. And I am a glass half full person. And just by the virtue of the phone calls that I've already received in the last week from police departments that are saying, okay, what is the answer? Help us and guide us. I do think that this is a moment when it can be a teachable moment and we can move forward in a positive direction.
But you don't think we're always walking this tightrope, the United States always teetering on the brink, if you like, of racial crisis?
Yes, we do. I mean, when you look at civil disturbances in the United States, often they reflect major issues of repression and oppression, but more often than not, they're precipitated by an incident involving police. And so the police, as the front and center face of an oppressive society, have very important role in trying to move us forward in a positive direction. And they can, with bad behavior, send us down that very destructive path.
So let's get some final words. Paul Butler, what are your final thoughts about this?
You know, Nick, there was a program in New York where the idea was real simple, just to get people in minority communities and the police to say hello to each other when they see each other in the street. And you know what? There was a lot of resistance to just that. So we have a long way to go, especially with the police. The police have a lot of work to do to improve their law enforcement. It's really about democracy. If a bunch of people are afraid of the police or don't trust them, that's a problem for democracy. So the United States has a lot of work to do when it comes to building the relationship between police and African Americans and Latinos and our Arab and Muslim citizens.
Glenn Ford, it's a problem for democracy. It's a question of trying to get the police say hello to the people, or the other way around?
Well, you know, the Cambridge police sergeant and Professor Gates have been on the radio together recently. The police officer was quite apologetic. Now they are going to have beer together. But still, by the end of this year in New York City, 628,000 persons will have been stopped on the street, 90% of them not white. Now, I don't see how the beer fest translates into somehow hitting off that huge number in New York and elsewhere across the country. These stop and frisks are moments for confrontations to develop that don't have to happen. They only happen because of public policy that creates a hostile environment for black folks.
Okay, well, we've run right out of time. Thanks for taking part, all of you. Paul Butler, Glenn Ford and Laurie Friedel. We appreciate your thoughts and your perspective on this. And thanks for watching Inside Story. Always delighted, of course, to receive emails with thoughts about this show or other issues you think we should be tackling. Inside Story at aljazeera.net. From me, it's goodbye.